Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to take a review of The Monarchy of Fear by Martha Nussbaum. Now, Nussbaum is a very prolific philosophical writer or philosopher. She's an academic philosopher. She writes both essays and papers as well as writing more general-facing audience books, of which this is one. This is not. This is accessible. It's not like an academic paper that's super non-accessible or difficult to get through. Her primary area of concern, if my recollection is correct, I think she kind of has like three or four, but one of them is emotion, and that is largely what's covered in the book. Now, the second tagline of the book is a philosopher looks at the political crisis. And the political crisis to which she is referring is the election of Donald Trump. I think this was written around 2017, sometime in that way. And so in some ways it's reactionary. I think that some of the things have not aged necessarily well, or the way of looking at things, that it's pseudo-cataclysmic. Not cataclysmic's not the right word, but perhaps not being generous to the other side or painting the other side in a particular way. However, she does go through lengths to kind of give other side of the argument and do charitable interpretation. So to the extent that I think that she fails, and this is kind of abstract to start off the review with, but to the extent that I think she fails to paint the other side correctly, I think it's largely an area of misfocusing rather than misinforming. But anyways, getting into the book, she largely spends the first 60 or so pages talking about fear itself. And in it, she kind of sets it up as a sort of monarchical sort of system where it is one that is based on a sort of authoritarian need. And so she argues that you are... it arises from insecurity and this, fear, right, about one's position, and in doing so, it causes one to feel the need to get control, and this control is going to be like this fundamental fear response, hoping to get control, this type of stuff. It is this characteristic response, and she paints it as a rather childish sort of thing, starting the argument or the structure of how fear initiates in childhood or in birth, where you get like mad at your parent, you cry, you scream out, you cause harm in order to alleviate that fear or being driven, and then you kind of get what you want, and you learn to be a sort of monarch of sorts over your parent, dictating their behavior and this type of thing, is sort of the models she sets out. And this is contrasted with when she kind of comes full circle at the end of the book. It's contrasted with hope, where she argues for hope at the end of the book, and this is for her the inverse of fear, and she argues that fear leads you to want to have control over other people, and that this is kind of the social motivation in terms of fear. That way you don't have to be scared anymore, right? And that hope, so this is fear in the face of uncertainty, but hope in the face of uncertainty allows for the democratic ideal. And so this is why fear is monarchical, it's authoritarian, and hope is democratic. And this is kind of the initial unpacking. But from fear, she kind of unpacks three other emotions that she argues are born out of fear. She argues that envy, here, let's get them in order. Envy, anger, I think anger is the first one she covers, and also disgust. Now, in particular, I thought the disgust one was very interesting, but anger, she writes is kind of a sort of lashing out that is motivated by an initial sort of fear, and it is fear in a variety of ways, but I think the one that is particularly striking is fear at the loss of social standing, because she argues that some forms of anger are appropriate, if you're punishing someone in the forms of like helping society through preventing like more crimes from occurring. This isn't like the anger she's referring to, but in particular, the anger she's referring to, or she talks about retributive justice, and versus I forget the word that it's supposed to prevent, but prevent further crime, a deterring sort of effect. But she argues that a lot of times anger is motivated by this feel of the loss of status, and is relativistic, and it doesn't make sense, in terms of though the outcomes for society, except if you feel that you can bring someone else down, and then in doing so relativistically elevate yourself. This is one of the arguments she makes in there. There's like a lot of other arguments that are not that one, but that's an example. But the idea is that it's mostly stemming from a position of fear in order to have this anger. The second one, disgust, I think, is the second one she covers in chapter 4, and that's the politics of exclusion. It has a subheading. I think that most of the other chapters don't have a subheading, but she talks about that one, and I found that one quite striking, because she starts from this place of why are we disgusted by like bodily fluid and excrement and this type of stuff, and then it's a reasonable thing from a physical perspective because it connotes like disease and this sort of stuff, but then she goes further and talks about how we project this very same emotion type of disgust onto other people, and in particular, she does talk about the gay community and how this sort of disgust is projected upon them, as well as the black community, and also this sort of sexualization that is used to effectively otherize and this sort of stuff. She also talks about India a little bit, about how there's disgust between the Muslim population and the Hindu population, this sort of stuff. But the idea is that if you have a disgust response towards someone else, it justifies it justifies sort of negative behavior against them. And like one particularly striking example was when she was talking about African Americans, and I forget her analysis, but the example was very striking, talking about how the African Americans, like if they ate off particular plates, like white people would throw away the plates. This is like during Jim Crow era, and it was just like this preposterous type of thing because those same white people were eating off of eating food from kitchens that were operated by black people who served them food as well, and so the disgust response such that you would throw out your plates because they'd been so contaminated, and she discusses like this contamination in the sense that like people will refuse to eat like a plastic pill that they're just going to pass through their system if there's like a cockroach inside, even though their system can't digest the plastic. It's just the disgust for like the cockroach, and she talks about how this same sort of disgust that's not rooted in a sort of reasonableness, whereas like a disgust for like wanting to get away from a decomposing body because it can make you sick is reasonable, how it can get projected onto people in other groups, and it causes as negative behaviors that and implicit bias and stuff like this. And so I found that chapter particularly interesting. The next chapter was on envy, and trying to think of a particularly good example from that chapter. Not one is coming up in particular, but this is a form of fear, and it's a form of she does contrast envy and jealousy. So jealousy is the fear of like losing what you already have or it being taken away from you, but envy is a sort of not a dislike for what someone else has, and this feeling of insecurity. And so in the feeling of insecurity, it's kind of rooted in the same sort of thing that fear is, but with it is a desire to lash out. And so she makes a distinction between envy and emulation, where emulation, you feel the same sort of, oh, I wish I could be that person, but you don't have the response to like want to drag that person down. And this kind of dovetails pretty well into the following chapter, which is 6, where she talks about sexism and misogyny, because largely she argues that a lot of misogyny is driven by envy. And so she does make the distinction between sexism and misogyny, which I'm uncertain if I think those definitions are correct, but as she defines them, she uses them, so it's fine. She argues that sexism, and perhaps these definitions are good, I think they're not colloquial understandings, so they're more academic kind of understandings, I would feel. But sexism is the belief that women are lesser than men. And there's like a passage she cites from John Stuart Mill, which is like, if women are like worse than men at XYZ, then why are you trying to prevent them at doing it? Because if they're just worse, they'll like weed themselves out anyways, so why would you try and prevent them? Which was, he was a person who was a proponent of women's rights in the I forget when John Stuart Mill was alive. I think in the late 1700s, maybe early 1800s, something like this. But the point is sexism is the belief that women are less capable or this type of thing, which is distinct from misogyny, which is about putting women in their place, as it were, or maintaining a certain sort of status quo. And so you could, for example, think that women are fully capable and want to maintain the status quo. And so this is like they are not necessarily they do not necessarily entail one another. Or you could think that I'm not sure if you can kind of think you can want social change, but you think women are less capable. I think that one's probably a little bit more difficult. But the sexism, misogyny doesn't entail sexism. You could think of a woman fully capable and still trying to keep her out. And through that chapter, there are a couple like tonal beats where like I was not a huge fan of her tone, and like this kind of comes up with style. I probably would have rated style a little bit higher, but there's like some parts where she seems like a little bit contemptuous of men, and that like made me a little bit uncomfortable. But maybe that's just me like having some sort of problem. I don't know that like I can't decide which one I think it is, but. Anyways, that was one of the chapters, which I think is also well within her purview. If I recall correctly, like she's written a lot on feminism. I think she wrote some essays on philosophy of language that I read in that course that had to do with, the consumption of like sexually explicit images and stuff, and if that like causes men to be more violent towards women. She was like arguing for censorship. Generally, she's like a little bit more aggressive about. The sort of interventions that should be done. Like she's advocates in this book for mandatory civil service as a means of community building, which I think her analysis that it would help build to communities and decrease bigotry, I think her analysis is correct because it would force a sort of melting pot where the biggest thing you could do to combat bigotry is force the people to grow up together and to have mixed experiences and to, associate with people with whom they are not familiar, and this familiarity sort of inoculates you against bigotry, and so she argues a sort of civil service would promote that type of thing, and I think she's correct, but I think you shouldn't force people to. I'm uncertain that there should be mandatory civil service, but that's kind of a bit of a tangent. And then her last chapter is Hope, Love, and Vision, in which she kind of brings everything like full circle and back to, democratic ideals and the idea that, if fear is this sort of insecurity in response to uncertainty that manifests in anger and envy and disgust and a sort of lashing out type of behavior, then the response or the antidote to this is hope. And the hope needs to be like rooted in action. She's like not talking about wistful, like non-active hope, but she does argue that this is the solution towards or for sort of fear. And she's in this chapter, I think, a lot more what's the word? Conciliatory, generally speaking, and is, in my mind, a lot more sensitive to trying to see both sides. In it, she discusses how she teaches with, like, a conservative thinker, and she's obviously very liberal, and that seeing both sides is important. There's other parts of the book where you, like, don't quite get that feeling, which is maybe something to be a little bit critical of her for, and so... But she brings it full home. She also has in here a like argument for like her vision of like an ideal like sort of system, which is very, big government-y. But I do think her analysis of emotion is particularly striking. I was really pleased with the discussed one. She argues for like human rights in the sense of central capabilities. I don't know if maybe you can read this. But this is kind of the way she couches it, and the idea is that, and this is not the primary thrust of the book, but I think it is a little bit interesting for kind of getting an idea of her worldview. She writes, the focus is on capabilities rather than actual functioning because the theory gives great importance to choice. People may choose to, that's probably not a very good quote to reflect, but her idea is that everyone should have the capability and choice to kind of dictate their own life, and that this involves, some government help. So the central capabilities are life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination, and thought. Emotions, which is kind of a weird right for me, practical reason, which includes some level of education and public spaces that are available for discourse, affiliation, which was an interesting right, other species, and this is to be able to care for animals and plants and stuff, play, control over one's environment. And she explains these, but I thought it was a bit interesting. And so definitely an interesting book, kind of a little bit oblique. It's kind of interesting to read someone who's from an academic background, because they will sometimes get the focus and kind of the trains of thoughts and the wisps of thought are definitely a lot different than someone who is just a layperson, and so it reads quite a bit differently, even though I think she does a good job being clear and not using overly academic prose or something like this. I mean, she invokes Immanuel Kant, so maybe the problem is I know the academic jargon, and it's just I filter out the fact that this is occurring, but I thought the book was relatively accessible. And with that, let's get into the ratings. So for utility, I ranked it a 5.5. I think that this one was a little bit hard for me to rank on utility. I felt this weird sort of sense of... so I'm not sure how useful it will be. It's a difficult one. I think her points are correct in that fear and insecurity is the root of a lot of negative emotions that are experienced, and these negative emotions hurt society. And if reading this allows you to root out some of those tendencies in yourself, and be oriented from a place that is not as much let's say fear oriented and instead hope oriented, to that extent I think that it's going to be useful. And also, I think that a lot of people do not or have not put a lot of thought into their emotions. And so to the extent that it is forcing you, even if you disagree with the book, to examine your thoughts on some of these emotions and this sort of stuff, I think it would be useful. And I think that it is also useful in the sense that it can give you a lot of interesting new perspectives that you maybe haven't seen. But there's not one singular striking this book will help you do this that I can come up with, which makes ranking utility a lot harder for me, because I think it's a lot of little things that are perhaps useful. And so it's not like she has a sort of, and also part of her arguments and part of how it could be useful would be to be a better community member and this type of thing, which is not generally my orientation when rating utility. So I give it a little bit better than an even sort of utility. It's fairly easy to read, fairly short. It's only 250 pages. So okay. I think some of the analysis is maybe not productive, but that's okay. For novelty, I give it a 6. I think that, again, this way of thinking is one that is not particularly mainstream. I think it's interesting. And so it's mainly from the sense of this kind of being uncommon in a way of looking at things and unpacking stuff through this emotion lens with a fair degree of analysis, I think is a novel and is not something you would see very often. She's certainly creating a model of something, which I don't necessarily... so models, to some extent, have some degree of fidelity in terms of how they reflect reality, and they're not always a 1-to-1 ratio, or they're never a 1-to-1 ratio. And so I think that her model maybe has less fidelity than a lot of other models, but then, I think when you're trying to model emotion, that's not something that's ever going to have very high fidelity in terms of how things are reflected, because every single sort of empirical evidence thing you could do relating to emotion requires the researchers to define particular emotions through observable, verifiable, and actions that are you can make numeric, and this is function. This is not how emotions work, and so it's hard to get empirical on these types of things. But we gave it a 6. For entertainment, I gave it a 5. I don't think it was especially like difficult or boring. At the same time, she wasn't repetitive. She used like a lot of references that people would, I think, understand, and it was like this, so it was fine. I don't think it was anything crazy. Maybe I should have ranked it a little bit higher. It was a fairly easy read. For style, I gave it a 6.5. I think her prose is very strong, very clear. I think she's a very strong thinker. I don't agree with all of her perspectives, but I think that I think she's very capable. I docked her a little bit because I think that sometimes she's contemptuous, and it was like a little bit distracting. Like in the outro, there's like a thing where she's citing, I think something of Cicero. Yeah, it's Cicero writing to, and maybe we can pull it up. Cicero writing to, and this is probably an okay example of this. Cicero is writing to his son. But the context of that it's his son is like completely irrelevant because we're just here to talk about Cicero, and she just like kind of interjects in this work addressed to his son, and then in a parenthetical aside, not an impressive man, but his more intelligent daughter had recently died in childbirth, and then that's the end of the aside, and there's no more mention of the daughter or the son. It's just a talking about Cicero's letter, and it's like this. This kind of like little contemptuous dig, it feels like, at, because the detail is not fundamentally important for anything she says following that, and so it's like this, it just feels like this weird contemptuous dig that like I like paused and I was like, is it because he's a man and the daughter was smarter and was a woman? It's like I not even arguing that the daughter wasn't smarter here, but like the why bring it up? It seems like just an unnecessary detail, and that type of thing rubs me the wrong way, and I felt like she did it in some spots, but maybe I'm just being misogynistic trying to put her, but like that doesn't make any, whatever. Anyways, just thought I would mention that that's like something, some aspect of her style that maybe people find off-putting, but overall I thought she had a very strong style, very clear writing in the classical style, which is the sense of you kind of explain what your argument is, and then you show your argument, and then the person can understand for themselves what the argument is, and her writing's clear. And okay. For readability, I gave it a 6. I think that the ideas are not extremely complicated, but it feels a little bit technical, especially like starting to discuss, like she talks about Nietzsche's ressentiment and like some philosophical ideas that are maybe a little bit less accessible. To some extent, I think I'm starting to like get bad at recognizing when something is a little bit hard to read, and this is probably a skill I need to work on a little bit. I don't know how I work on this, because like when someone references something I know about, it's not difficult if they don't explain it that well for me to understand, because I already know about it. And like I guess she maybe, like for the example of like the Nietzsche's ressentiment idea of like resentment with a special like a sense of wanting to make the other smaller, or this type of stuff. It was in the envy chapter. Like maybe that type of thing is like less accessible. It's a little bit difficult, but overall I thought it was accessible. And if you wanted to read something that's analytic and technical on emotion, I think this would be good. For interest, I gave it a 7.5. I thought the book was very interesting. I thought that some of the models were really interesting. In particular, the discussion on disgust, I found probably that was the most interesting chapter for me. But also the characterizing fear as being a monarchical sort of thing that like sunk your hooks in and like operated in a particularly like I think the metaphor was striking and interesting, and it fit, and I thought that was an interesting way of capturing the thing. I don't think like necessarily like the describing, like I don't think it's necessarily corresponds with reality, but I think it textures and colors reality to think of through the metaphor of like fear is like a monarchy, hope is like a democracy, like this type of thing. And in the democracy chapter, she discusses quite a bit about why having respect for others and not being not giving into fear so that you feel envy, anger, or disgust towards others is what is fundamentally important for democracy. And maybe I should have said that more in my summary when I was kind of summarizing, because I think that's the striking point. you cannot, if the other members of your society you feel anger, envy, or disgust towards, it makes it much harder to have a civilized democracy where discourse takes place. And this is like kind of the culminating thrust of her argument. And so I thought yeah, I thought the book was very interesting. It's a lot of like, it's not like some vapid piece of political analysis, right? Even though it's responding to a political time, and I think that her position is a little bit more, although she criticizes people on the left for being like overreacting to like the election of Trump. And so perhaps I'm not having a full appreciation of the moment where people on the left are just like very upset that Trump got elected. But I forgot the point I was going to make. Anyways, as far as recommendations go, this is not. It's not a book I think I would recommend that wildly because it doesn't really fulfill a particular niche. Although I enjoyed the book quite a bit, and so it's. I mean, I think you probably have to be interested in the philosophy of motion specifically for maybe this to be a useful one, or be interested in the concept of emotion. I have already had some reading on the concept of emotion for this to maybe be the book for you. I think that as far as like I struggle to think of a single person in my life for whom this would be in the number like top 5 books I would recommend to them, unless they expressed, especially right now, because it was kind of in response to a moment when it was written, which was the election of Trump. So, like, perhaps people who were really upset that Trump got elected in 26. I mean, maybe it's going to be useful in 2024 now when he gets, if he gets reelected. I think it's more likely than not he beats Biden, but not by a huge margin. I think it's pretty close, kind of resembling a coin flip. But perhaps this book will become timely again in that sense. Yeah, I mean, in the women chapter, she focuses a little bit on like specifically addressing some of the comments he's made about women and this type of stuff, and looping that back into the discussion as well, where referring to women's like, so bodily fluids are an inspiration of disgust, and so referring to like women through their bodily processes and fluids and like this sort of thing as a means to provoke that type of thing, so that you can engage in the misogynist act of putting them in their proper place. This is the type of thing, and so like the book fits together quite well as well, in terms of developing a sort of model and an argument and fitting it together, and most of the examples are apt. And so, but I have a hard time thinking of who I would recommend it to, just because I maybe it is a book for people who are interested in philosophy specifically, and specifically the philosophy of emotion, and it's not really that mainstream. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm thing, and other than that, have a good one.